School avoidance and chronic absenteeism in conventional schools is a growing issue in the United States and around the world. And the standard response to children not wanting to attend school usually involves increasing levels of rewards and punishments. But is this really addressing the issue? What could we do instead? And we're incredibly fortunate to have Dr. Naomi Fisher with us to think through these issues today. She's the author of a number of books, including some that I wasn't even aware of yet. Uh, including Changing Our Minds, A Different Way to Learn, and most recently, When the Naughty Step Makes Things Worse, The Art and Science of Low Demand Parenting. Naomi Fisher, welcome, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Joel. It's really nice to be here. Hello, everybody. I'm just gonna, can you pin me or spotlight me somehow, Joel? Because I think
Yep,
otherwise
I think you're good
that,
now.
that
Okay.
way everybody can see it sort of works when I share the slides. Okay, so I'm going to share my slides and let's get started. And just to say, I can't manage to read the chat whilst I'm talking. So if there is an issue, like if you can't see my slides or you can't hear me or anything, somebody needs to tell me, because if you're all saying something in the chat, I won't be able to hear. So welcome. It's really nice to see you all here. And today I'm going to talk about school avoidance, or many other, as I'll talk about, there are many other ways of talking about what it is. But I'll start off just by introducing myself. So I'm Dr. Naomi Fisher. I'm a clinical psychologist. And sometimes people say, what? Surely you mean you're an educational psychologist. In fact, they don't say that. They just write it. When they write about me, they say educational psychologist. Actually, educational psychology and clinical psychology are two separate things, two separate trainings. And my training is clinical psychology, which means that I specialize in mental health. And that's what I was trained in. And I think that's the angle I always come at when talking about education, really. I'm fascinated by education. I talk about it a lot, but I'm always really coming at it from the angle of child development and mental health, rather than as somebody who's worked in schools. Because I'm someone who I sort of see the system from the outside. And the reason I see it from the outside is because as a clinical psychologist, I work with children and young people as well as parents, and we're referred people all the time. So I hear a lot about what's going on in the world around us. And one of the things that I hear an increasing amount is about school and about how school is causing young people distress. So what I'm going to be talking about today, I'm first going to talk about school avoidance. Then I'm going to talk about where the problem actually is. So this is one of these things I quite often talk about where do we locate the problem when we think about children who aren't attending school? And then I'm going to come on to thinking about what we could do differently. So as Joel said in his introduction, an increasing number of children, not just in the United States and the United Kingdom, but I think across the world, are actually struggling to attend school. And we describe these children in a lot of different ways. So in this talk, we've used school avoidance. School refusers is another term that's often used, particularly in the press. There's often talk about truants, dropouts, skivers, people who are anxious, school anxiety, or there's talk about bad behavior. There are all of these phrases. I've listed these words together deliberately because sometimes there's a kind of division. There's the things like truancy and dropouts, which is kind of seen almost like, bad behavior. And then there's school avoidance and anxiety, which is seen as mental health. And we sometimes those two things are presented as quite different. I don't really see them as hugely different. I see them as young people who, for some reason, are not really engaged with their education. And the big difference that can happen between a child who might be defined as a truant or one who might be defined as school avoidant. Actually, if you look in the books, I've read the books will say that the big difference is that a school avoidant child is doing so with the knowledge of their parents. So they might be at home, not going to school. A truant will be doing it without the knowledge of their parents. So they may be pretending to go to school, and actually, when they get there, they don't go to school, they go off into town or they hang out in the park next to the school. And when I read that and I was like, no, there's a clear issue here in that the difference isn't actually anything to do with the child. The difference could well be to do with the parents. So that some parents are more accepting of their child really feeling very unhappy at school, and some parents aren't. And so I don't think it necessarily makes sense to say that there must be different reasons between a child who is truanting and a child who is avoidant, not going to school, but is at home. Anyway, what happens to these children typically, once they've been given lots of different labels, is that they often get sent off for assessments and sometimes diagnoses by somebody like me. And it's funny, I was looking for photographs to put this, and you can only really find photographs of small children having assessments and diagnoses. So I don't think this child is not going to school, but often what happens is if a child isn't attending school, then they can get sent to see someone like me, and we will give them diagnoses. Some of the diagnoses or the labels, actually, I've put labels because actually none of these are official diagnoses. So in the UK, we often call these children emotionally based school avoiders. As I've said, the old term was school refusers, school phobics, which never really made sense to me, that you're kind of terrified of school. Maybe you have school anxiety. These are all the words that we might use to describe these children. We also talk about their parents, and it's not very complimentary about them either. Their parents tell me that often what they feel is happening when their child isn't going to school is there's a kind of implicit message that you aren't trying hard enough. They aren't pushing hard enough. People say things like, well, I just don't give mine the option. As if one parent said to me, as if I'm waking up in the morning and saying, you've got an option, you don't have to go. And yes, or they say they're not setting firm enough boundaries. They say they don't care enough about education. You often see that in the press, that these parents just don't care enough to get their children out of bed every morning and send them to school. Or sometimes it's more direct and the parents are called feckless and lazy. And in the UK, I don't know if this is happening in the United States, but in the UK, we have fines for parents whose children aren't attending school regularly. We even have fixed penalty fines in some cases. So I've worked with families who are just fined, their child is absent for a certain number of days in the school year, and there's an automatic fine. Which there's no one seems to have any discretion about. The school doesn't have any discretion about it. Doesn't matter why the child's been absent, but you've got too much absence, you get your fine. All of these things locate the problem very firmly in the child and their family. And as a psychologist, this is one of the things I'm always asking when I think about a situation. I'm always saying, where is this problem being located? Where are we being encouraged to think that the problem lies? And I think with school attendance difficulties, we're very strongly being encouraged to think that the problem are children and families, maybe parents not preparing their children enough for work, for the world of school, or children just not trying hard enough or being lazy, whatever. So then that's often where people like me come in. So because if we decide that a child is anxious, then often what will happen is they'll be sent to see a psychologist. If the problem is behavior, then also they might be sent to see a psychologist, or parents might go to see a psychologist. If they didn't need diagnosis, they'll say, let's try a psychologist or a psychiatrist for that. If the problem's poor parenting, which some will say it is, then they need a parenting program, might be run by a psychologist. And if the problem is lack of motivation, then they need to be fined. That's thankfully not something that they ask psychologists to do. But it felt to me when I was in this position that as a mental health service, we were being asked to fix children and sent them back to school. So we'd have a child who isn't attending school, and it would be defined as this child is anxious. And so you need to do something which will reduce their anxiety. You need to treat their anxiety. And, I do treat anxiety. That is one of the things that I know how to do as a therapist. I can treat anxiety. But when I was talking to these children and their families, and they were telling me what was going on at school, I was thinking, but I'm being asked to treat these children as if their anxiety is irrational, as if, in fact, they have a mental health problem, when actually it sounds like what is going on at school is entirely unreasonable and is also something that would make anybody or a lot of people feel very distressed and anxious. And one of the things that I feel really passionately about as a psychologist is that my role is not to take away normal emotional reactions. My role is not to try and make people feel okay with situations which are unjust, for example. And I felt like that was happening with school. And I found this really, really frustrating, because it was be like you'd have a child, you'd be referred a child, and it was like the goal was defined in advance. The goal was that they had to get back to school. But then they'd tell me stories of what was happening at school, and I would think this seems completely reasonable for them not to want to go. But the goal was still really to get them back to school. And I remember in the early years when I just started out as a clinical psychologist, which was before I had children of my own, I remember very much being in that mindset as well, seeing children, seeing teenagers, And really I remember one girl in particular, actually, who I worked with for quite a long time. And her parents decided at the end that they weren't going to send her back to school. I think she was about 14 or 15. They decided that they were going to keep her out of school, home educate, that they would do some exams, and then she would probably go back to college. So we have, in the UK, we have sort of college is what we call the last 2 years of school, 16 to 18. Um, and I can remember feeling really strongly that that was a bad choice on their part. I find it so interesting now, having home educated my own children for years and having made very alternative choices for them. But I was very much, I think, simply in the mindset that society was in, that, school is the right place for a child. School is the right place for this person. And I remember writing a letter, making it clear that I didn't agree that her not going back to school was the right thing to do. And now I think they were probably making absolutely the right decision, but I didn't see it like that at all then. But I've thought about it a lot since, obviously. And part of the reason that I think differently, I think about this to lots of professionals, is actually because of my own story, because I had trouble attending school myself at two times in my life, aged 5 and again aged 13 or 14. And I know now that I was right on trend with that, because actually the research shows that there are particular points where young people are more likely to have trouble with school. There's starting school when you're about 5. Then there's the pivot between elementary school and middle school or high school, or in the UK, it's primary school, secondary school. So when they're around 11. And then it's this age 13, 14, where the pressure often starts to ramp up and the social pressure starts to ramp up. I remember quite well what it felt like, particularly when I was older. And I remember that I wasn't really anxious, that school anxiety did not describe what was going on for me. School felt like a complete hostile place, but it also felt like a waste of my time. And I know that if I'd been sent to see a psychologist to have cognitive behavior therapy or something to try and make me feel less anxious, that would not have worked at all, because the problem wasn't anxiety. The problem was that I was deeply unhappy at school and that I found it a really not a useful place to spend my time. Everybody was always telling me that it wasn't as bad as I thought it was, and that if I just kept going, I'd know and it'd be all right, and I'd make friends and it'd be fine. And yet that wasn't happening. And I didn't need more people trying to say that. And when I've talked to teenagers who've seen psychologists, I talked to one boy who's 15, and he said, I interviewed him for my book, actually. So he said, when I went to see the psychologist, they treated it like like I was scared of dogs. So if you have a dog phobia, one of the things that we'll do in psychology is that we'll try and gradually get you used to dogs. So you might first see a photograph of a dog, and then maybe you might see a toy dog, and then you might gradually move up to seeing a little tiny dog, and then you might move. Anyway, you get the picture. You gradually get used to dogs that are bigger. And so because your fear of dogs is limiting your life. And he said they did it the same with school. So it would be, first, maybe we'll just go and walk around the outside of the school. Then we'll go and touch the gate in the school. Then maybe you spend half an hour in the school. And he was like, but the problem wasn't that I was anxious about the school. The problem was school made me feel terrible and it wasn't the right place for me. And I think we don't hear those stories enough. And we also don't really want to listen because it's quite inconvenient. It's much more convenient to think the problem's the child and we should be able to sort them. And it's something, certainly until a few years ago, I felt a deep internal tension about whenever I had a referral for a child who wasn't attending school, because I always knew that there would be these competing goals, this competing idea of, should I be trying to get this child back into school when I can see that actually school isn't a good place for them or isn't working for them? So I think we need to stop looking so hard at children and their families, and we need to start asking about the interaction between children and school. Because I think it's kind of indisputable that school wasn't really designed with children's needs in mind. So in the UK, we've had compulsory schooling since I think something like 1890. Well, it's similar in the United States. It's around the same time, 1880, 1890, education became compulsory. And at the time, it was really brought in to stop child labour. And it was just for 5 to 10-year-olds, at least in the UK, but to stop people sending children up chimneys and that kind of thing. And it was also designed at a time when access to information was limited. So teachers held information which others couldn't access. Maybe they weren't literate, they just did not have access to other information. And for a teacher to deliver that information to a group of children was an efficient and relatively cheap way to do it. And so that's what they set up. They didn't think, what do children really need? How should we provide that? They also didn't do any kind of studies or controlled experiments to say, okay, so what might happen if we put children through this schooling or this schooling? What effect will this have on their childhood? They just assumed that this was going to be a good thing. And so they said, right, compulsory education. And since then, the number of years that young people have had to spend in education has been growing and growing and growing. So in the UK, you now have to be in compulsory full-time education until you're 18. But we know a lot more now about what children need to thrive. We have a whole body of research on developmental psychology. We know much more about how children learn and what they need, but yet we're still doing something very similar to what the Victorians did. We are still sitting children in rows and telling them things and encouraging them to remember those things. And if they won't remember those things, then we're doing things like punishing, well, we're giving them gold stars for doing it well. We're probably leaning a bit more on the side of the gold stars than the Victorians did. I think the Victorians leaned more on the side of corporal punishment if you didn't cooperate. But we didn't, they didn't set out to do something that met children's needs. They set out to do something that would keep children away from the workforce and learning basic skills. We call it the 3 R's in England. I don't know if you do the same: reading, writing, arithmetic. But what we know now, what psychologists know about children, is that young children learn really differently to being sat in desks and being told information, because young children are discovery learners. And that's quite a different way of approaching the world to older children and adults. And what it really means is that young children play all the time, and that they're exploring the world and asking questions and problem solving. And anyone who's had a child will know that this starts really early on, from before they can talk. They're reaching out to explore the world. It's a very messy stage of life because this kind of learning is messy. It's not linear. It's hard to test. Developmental psychologist Alison Gopnik talks about young children as having a kind of approach to the world which is like a scientist, that they go out there and they test hypotheses, and she says they're really gathering information about the whole world at this time of their lives, which means that their focus is not on honing skills. Their focus is on, how can I get as wide exposure to everything as possible? To adults, this often looks like flitting from thing to thing, for example. Or the other thing that adults sometimes say is, oh, they just do things on a whim all the time. And yes, they do, because they see something that looks interesting and they go over to investigate it. And then they see something else that looks interesting and they go over to investigate that. And they move on from thing to thing to thing. And discovery learning is something that adults can set up environments for, but they can't really control. Because once an adult comes in and says, we're going to do this, then you've limited that discovery for the child. Because actually, what works best for discovery learners is as free an environment as possible. And I think a lot of early years settings do get this quite right. They set up different, if you go into a good nursery, they'll have like the water play section, they'll have sand, they'll have the home corner, they'll have the book corner, they'll have the construction area with blocks and Lego, and children will be allowed to choose what they do within those different areas. And adults will have chosen the things that are set up there because they know what children this age enjoy and what they like doing. And this is the discovery phase, the discovery learning phase of life. Alison Gopnik, whose research I think is pretty well entirely with children who are schooled. This is another thing that I really thought about a lot when I had my children and they didn't go to school. Because I also have a PhD in developmental psychology as well as my doctorate in clinical psychology. And I thought, nobody ever said, all the studies, everything that you're studying is all about children who are at school. It's all the stuff that we're doing about child development and how they learn how to do this at this age and how this thing, changes, and they're able to do this at this age. It's all about development in the context of school. And it was like so many children are at school that it was like schools is just this invisible intervention into childhood, which nobody even mentioned. But when I had my own children and they were out of school, and I could actually see quite quickly the big difference that it made not being in school as compared to school children, because of course we knew loads of other children who went to school. And it was sort of mind-blowing for me, actually, because I kept thinking, who is looking at this? Who's tracking how children learn when they don't go to school? Because one of the things that I noticed is, say, if you read if you read Alison Gopnik's work, she'll say children are really pure discovery learners up to about 6 or 7, and then they start to engage in more mastery learning. Talk a little bit more about what that is. But what I saw with my children and with the other children around us was that this kind of discovery phase went on longer than for the children in school. And that made complete sense to me because I wasn't telling them that actually they should be doing something else. So when you put children in a school, quite quickly they're told, play is for playtime, or you can do that after school, but you can't do that now. You need to focus on what I'm teaching you now. You need to sit down and listen. There's a whole set of things children learn in those first few years of school. And a lot of the things they learn are actually devaluing of discovery learning or devaluing of play, because adults tend to prioritize a particular kind of learning. Adults prefer, and this is how many adults learn, they prefer mastery learning. And mastery learning is when we are developing skills intentionally. So it's when we're becoming good at something. So discovery learners tend to do things because they enjoy doing them. That is the only reason that they're doing it, really. Whereas when you get into the mastery learning stage, which starts to develop as you get towards puberty and into teenage and adolescence, at this point, there's more of a thought of, right, what do I want to be able to do in the future? What might I need to do with that? And how might I get better? So it's when you start to hone your skills, you practice deliberately and you get better at something. This ability to kind of hold a goal in mind is actually quite a sophisticated one, and it's not one that young children are very good at. So it makes sense that younger children aren't really able to hold on to the idea, right, I want to be good at playing the piano, for example, and so I'm going to practice the piano. For young children, they like seeing the piano, they like to bang around on the piano. They might do that more or less, depending on their individual temperament, but they're quite unlikely to, of their own volition, say, I want to be really good at the piano and I am going to spend hours practicing in order to do that. Whereas when children get a bit older, and I started to see the shift around the age of 9, they start to think about, right, what is it that I want to do? And I'm going to practice. So there's a difference now where they're doing things because they want to get to a further goal rather than because they just really enjoy what they're doing right now. So schools are not well developed for discovery learning, but they're actually not that great for mastery learning as well either. And although they try very hard to impose mastery learning on children, but the thing is that mastery learning works best when you're doing something because you want to do it. So the difference between, for example, practicing the piano because you want to get better at the piano and practicing the piano because you've been told you've got to practice the piano for an hour is enormous. It's huge in how you feel about it, but it's also huge probably in the quality of the practice. The quality of practice when you are doing it because you want to get better is completely different to I'm doing this because I've got to clock up the minutes. And yet with our children, a lot of the time we're putting them in this position of making them go through the motions. And what we see really throughout child development is that it's this autonomy, this choice that makes the difference between high quality learning, high quality motivation, and the child who doesn't want to do things, the child who isn't motivated. And we know, and I'm going to come back to school avoidance in a minute, don't worry. We know that in order to feel high quality motivation, humans need these 3 conditions to be met. This is from Dietschy and Ryan, self-determination theory. They need autonomy, they need connections with others, and they need a sense of competency and mastery. And that sense of competency and mastery isn't necessarily being good at something, it's a feeling that I can be good at something. And if you spend any time with young children, they usually have a really good, well-developed sense of this sense of competence and mastery. In fact, it's often way beyond their skills. And that's another reason their parents are running behind them, trying to stop them from doing things, because they feel that they are capable. And that's a really important thing, that sense that you're capable. And unfortunately, what happens to quite a lot of children when they go into the school system is they learn that they're not capable. They learn that they're not as capable as others. They compare themselves very quickly to other children. And we know that even when schools do things like divide children up into tables, they put the children they think are most capable on one table and the children they think are less capable on another table. children become aware of that really quickly, even if the school makes quite a big effort to hide it from them. So, schools will do things like call the tables names of animals or colors to not make it obvious that this table is those who can read and this table is those who can't. Children work that out really quickly. And studies show that 6-year-olds can tell you which children in the class are considered to be clever, which children aren't. They know where they are. And that affects how they think about themselves. And the research actually shows that sort of internal sense of I am clever or I'm not clever actually predicts their later achievement in maths. So if you think of yourself as somebody who isn't good at maths when you're 6, the likelihood is that you will not do as well at maths when you're older, even when you're matched with another child who is an equal level of maths with you, but they think they're good at maths. I found this an amazing finding when I first read it. I was like, why are we not now developing our education system so to help children feel good at things? Because we know that feeling good at things, feeling capable of doing things, is a really strong predictor of what they're able to do later on. But unfortunately, that doesn't happen at school, because what happens is we take these things away from children. So we take meaningful choices away from them early on. In fact, one of the ironies of the school system, in my opinion, is that the older children get, the fewer meaningful choices they have. The place where there are the most meaningful choices in the mainstream school system is when you're about 4. From then on, it's a narrowing down until when you're about 15 or 16, there's almost no choices in terms of what I mean. I don't mean that you can't necessarily choose a subject, but I mean, it doesn't matter what subject you choose really, because you're still going to be sitting in a classroom being told what to do, and you're still not going to be able to go to the bathroom when you want to go to the bathroom, all that kind of thing. They have competitive relationships with others rather than focus on connection, and there's a focus on weaknesses and very little chance to become competent. And unfortunately, this is happening earlier and earlier to our children, because we're pushing play and that discovery stage out of the curriculum, because it's seen as hard to measure and it seems very unfocused and messy. It's messy. Young children are being compared and tested against each other really quickly, and parents are often anxious about results and how their children are doing from the get-go. So I meet parents who say things like, their child's just started school, they've only been there a term, and they're called in for a parent meeting, and it's all the things that their child isn't doing yet. They're not doing this, they're not doing this, they're not doing this. And it's a really demoralizing way to start education for anybody, for the child, but also for the parents, because the parents say that we often, there's often a kind of feeling, if you haven't prepared them well enough for school, you haven't got them ready for this process, which they should all be able to do. So I think it's unsurprising that in this context, we have a problem with children who either they say they don't want to learn or they refuse to go to school. And often what happens is it takes a few years for the effect of what we're doing to children to kind of really play out. So I think it's a cumulative effect. So I don't, sometimes when I talk to parents of a child who's not attending school, sometimes something big has happened. More often, it's just a gradual, slow drip, drip, drip of things not going well, of them feeling increasingly unhappy, not feeling supported, but also of just feeling like they aren't connected with the rest of the community. They don't feel good about themselves, and they don't have any meaningful choices. They can't do the things that they're really interested in. And then what happens in school is that this is responded to by using behavioral control and high stakes testing. And the thing about this is that we've got children who aren't so interested in learning anymore, because we've removed the factors that make it easier to learn, which is letting them have choices about what they do. So then we say, right, you've got to do really well in these tests, or you've got to do really well, because if you don't, then you won't get the certificate, or we'll give you stickers if you do well, or even, we have things in the UK where people are giving book tokens out in assembly for children who attend every day. There's a lot of rewards or punishments for those who aren't complying. And I don't think any of this makes school a good environment for learning. And I don't think it's at all surprising that some children say no to this. In fact, I kind of think it's surprising that so many of them continue to say yes for as long as they do, because my perspective would definitely be that I don't think school avoidance necessarily means there's anything at all wrong with a child, but I think those children are telling us something which the others can't say. So I think of these children as very clear-sighted, and often the things they tell me about their education are really clear-sighted. They see right through the systems. They see right through the behavior apps. For example, some children in secondary schools now have a behavior app. Anything that their anything that goes wrong, they'll get a red mark in the behavior app. Their parents will be sent things as well. And teenagers will be like, they're telling us all the time that we shouldn't be on our smartphones. But look, they've got this app, which is like tying everything about the school to the smartphone. I'm like, yeah, you're right. That is a bit of a contradiction there. But I think the big thing really is that I don't think we should be trying to fix a child who is saying this isn't working for me, because I don't think that's a message we want to be giving this child, that there's something wrong with you. Unfortunately, that doesn't make life easier necessarily if you do have a child who's struggling to go to school, because it does mean there's no quick fix, there's no easy way out of this. So what could we do differently? So I think we can't fix children and force them back into an environment that isn't working for them. I actually don't think it's ethical to do so, just to not listen to them and to keep pushing them back in. Sometimes parents are told, if you don't keep making your child go to school, they will get more anxious, and therefore you must keep making them go to school. I think that is based on a misunderstanding of the psychology. Because I talked already about exposure therapy, and how the way that exposure therapy works is that you gradually increase the exposure to whatever the feared thing is. I think in the case of school, generally, often the anxiety a child is feeling isn't irrational. And exposure therapy is about an irrational anxiety. So it's when your anxiety is out of kilter to the thing that you're anxious about. So, if you are, I did work with someone once who was very, very anxious about baked beans. They actually were terrified of baked beans. And it's very unlikely that baked beans are going to hurt you. So we could do gradual exposure to baked beans. I've also done gradual exposure with people who are very scared of dogs, spiders, things that actually the anxiety is out of kilter to the thing that's making them anxious. If you're very unhappy at school, then that's not the same as being irrationally anxious about it. And if you are forced repeatedly into this situation where you are very, very unhappy, it can have the opposite effect. So rather than thinking, oh yes, that will make me that child less anxious, what it can do is actually make them more and more anxious, because every time they go, they're actually realizing this is as bad as I thought it was, or maybe it's even worse. And now I can't trust anybody to listen to me when I'm saying that, because I'm being forced in. So they either get more and more terrified, and I've worked with children for whom that's happened, and they become really sensitized to anything to do with school, so they won't walk past it, they won't walk past a playground with other children in it, they won't open a book at all, anything that looks at all like school, anything that looks like a worksheet, no, they won't have anything to do with it. Or they completely shut down. And I think some children just go into a state of kind of despair, where they're saying, because nobody, if they feel like nobody's listening to them, and they go into this total sort of numbed state where, and often when that happens, sometimes everybody thinks that means things have got better. So sometimes people say, oh, they're much happier now. But actually, if you look closely, they're not relaxed and happy. They've just switched off. They are, and those children, if this is your child, probably what you'd see is that they might be described as very, very compliant during the school day. So school will say, no problems here. But after school, everything is very difficult. So parents will sometimes say, I just don't understand. School says they're completely fine in school, really well behaved. They get home and it's just awful. They are screaming and shouting and hitting us. And it's just like chalk and cheese, and we don't understand it. And sometimes what will happen then is school will say, oh, you need to make home more like school. They'll say, probably what's happening is we've got this great structure at school. They feel really safe with the structure. You should do that at home as well. You should structure your time at home, and just, and also you should have punishments if they behave in certain ways, just like we do at school, all of that kind of thing. I see it completely differently. I think it's that the children are shut down at school, and then at home they feel able to show how they're feeling, because children will show us how they're feeling when they feel safest. And if you feel safe with your parents, unfortunately, what that means as the parent is you often see the worst behavior. So I think that if we're thinking that the environment isn't right for a child, then I think we should be thinking about how to change the environment rather than change the child, which would mean thinking about an environment, a learning environment that focuses on autonomy, so meaningful choices, connections between people, and helping children feel competent, helping them develop this sense of themselves as competent learners. And I think something that runs through the school system is this idea that children must be made to learn, or else there will be complete disaster, that they must be forced to do things, because if we didn't force them to do things, they would just choose to do nothing at all. It's like we have this very, I don't know where it's come from, but this kind of very fixed view of children as intrinsically not wanting to do things, not motivated to do things. And I find it really odd that we've got this idea, because if we look at just adults around us, I know loads of adults who are doing very challenging things without any pay, without any motivation. I know adults who do things like run triathlons in their spare time. And they train. I know adults who learn languages for fun in their spare time. So I know people who set themselves these very challenging goals and work towards them. And yet it's like we don't believe that children have that drive too, even though we know, again, that the under fives, before they've been to school, they're pretty driven as well. In fact, it's pretty hard to stop them from learning and exploring. But yet between these ages of like 5 and 18, 5 and 16, we tend to think we must make them do stuff because otherwise they'll just lay around and do nothing. And I wish I knew where that kind of belief that children are intrinsically lazy and not motivated to do anything comes from, because I don't see that. And I think that unfortunately, what can happen in schools can make children seem like they're lazy and unmotivated because they are so unmotivated by what's being offered to them. But when you work with self-directed young people, that isn't what you see. You don't see that they're unmotivated. You don't necessarily see that they're motivated to learn the things that people are learning at school. I think that's a really important thing to have to, when you think about autonomy and about people making more choices, people sometimes say to me, I really want them to be self-directed learners. I want them to make the choices for themselves. But then they say, but I also really want them to do maths and English and French and science. And I'm like, well, sorry, you can't, because you can't have it both ways. You can't say, I want them to be able to choose, but I only want them to be able to choose if they choose the things that I want them to choose. And I think that's the problem we've got in the school system. It's like they're only allowed to choose if they make our choices, if they make the choices that we want. And I think this sort of sums up the dilemma that we've got, because I don't think we can have it both ways. So I don't think we can have a sort of focus on they must get these high exam results and we must give them autonomy. I think if you allow young people more autonomy, some of them will choose not to focus on exams. Some of them will choose not to take exams. And you have to be open to that. You can't sort of set the goal as it has to be like this, and then you can only choose within those parameters. I don't think we can really have linear progression and also recognize difference. So we've got this feeling in the school system, people have to progress through it step by step by step. I don't think we can kind of hold on to that, as well as recognizing how very different young people are and how some young people are on really different trajectories. And some young people, for example, aren't ready to learn to read and write until quite a lot later than others. We can't do that whilst also putting everyone through this sort of standardized system. And I think we also can't really be child centers and getting through the curriculum. And I sometimes think when I talk to teachers, that teachers are kind of forced into this position of trying to pretend that you can do these things together. And I think about when I worked in the National Health Service, our health service in the UK, I remember feeling these kind of contradictions sometimes, where we would have cuts to our service. So they would cut the amount of money that we had in order to provide the service. But at the same time, we had to show that our service was doing what it's meant to do and hitting its targets and seeing all the people that we could see. So we were in this kind of impossible situation of having to say, oh yes, so we're providing a service. You've cut our money, but still we're going to be able to provide the service. But actually, I felt like we should just been saying, well, you've cut the money. We're not going to be able to provide such a good service anymore. But they put us in this position. And I think teachers get put in the same position of kind of having to prove that they can do it. And even whilst they're put in an impossible situation. And I think our education system has just been restricted for far too long by this question of will they get good exam results? And certainly in the UK, there's been a kind of prioritizing of good exam results over everything else. So, everything is justified in the name of good exam results. And parents, everybody will put up with a lot in the name of good exam results. So we see young people in a lot of distress. And it's kind of like, but they've got to keep them going just to get them through those exams. And we just don't want them to fall on this hurdle now. And I think the whole question about exam results is itself problematic, because it's never going to be the case that everyone's going to get good exam results, because good exam results only exist really in comparison to not such good exam results. And at every point through the school system, good basically means better than other people your age. It doesn't mean objectively good, because children are growing up and they're immature. It means you're doing better than everyone else your age, which means that basically good is not possible for everyone to achieve. Completely realistically, half of children are going to come out the end of their education system with below average results. They have to, because average is the middle. So, and we've had one of our government ministers talking about how shocking it is that so many children come out with below average, under average, below average results, but they have to. That's the way averages work. There is no way for everybody to get above average. It's mathematically impossible. So by accepting that good exam results should be our aim, we kind of accept that many children are going to end their education with a sense of failure. And I think that's a really bad way to end education. So I think the only way to do this better is to sort of throw out the model that the Victorians offered us and start with the child and their needs, which really means that instead of trying to get children to change, instead of trying to change them to fit into the mold, we should be thinking about how schools can become more flexible. And I know some schools that are really making a massive effort here. And what they often do is they focus on relationships first. So they say the most important thing is that you want the children feel welcome here, that they want to be here, and that we're going to make this an environment that they want to come to, and they see the children as individuals. It takes quite a lot for a school to do this, because you do have to push against the current sort of trends. And it's particularly hard if you're not getting excellent exam results. And I think it's really sad that schools that are doing such amazing work to really meet the children that they have where they are often met with the question, well, are you getting good exam results? Or your exam results aren't as good as that other school, which isn't bothering about relationships. It's like that we don't think anything is worth it unless it gets good exam results when it comes to children. So what I think we need is more play in the early years, more child-led play, and then more choices about learning as they get older. So every time that we make the test the aim, we lose learning, really. They stop learning so well, because learning to pass tests is not the same as learning. In fact, I would say I'm someone who really learned how to pass tests well. I did a lot of exams between the ages of about 15 and 25. And I became really good at taking exams. It's been completely useless as a skill since then. I have never had to sit down and do a 3 or 4 hour exam since I left university, since I finished my doctorate. Actually, I'd had to do it in my doctorate. Sorry, just going to get a drink of water. But yet we insist that young people spend these years honing their ability to take the test, because really allowing them to choose means they're going to make different choices to what we might have thought for them, which is hard. But I think this is a crucial part of adolescence, that they need that time to practice making choices and making different choices to what the adults in their life might make. And actually, we're taking that away from them by this focus on they must all go through these certain things during their school years. So I think we should focus on connections rather than comparisons between people. And I think we need to see behaviour as a communication that things are not going right here, particularly on maths. So if we have a lot of young people who are not going to school, or who are saying, I'm really unhappy at school, I think we need to be thinking, right, what's going on in the school system, rather than let's get all of those kids mental health treatment. I think there's something that's not right. And I mean, in the UK, at least, I don't know if it's the same in the United States, but we also have a lot of teachers saying they're really unhappy at school, and a lot of teachers leaving the profession. So we've got a system where it doesn't seem like anybody is really happy. And yet we're still blaming people for that. And what the response was when teachers have been saying they're not happy is, again, to maybe offer them more pay. So trying to incentivize them again, rather than thinking about, okay, what is going on in our schools that means that they're not environments where humans are thriving. I think young people need chances to dive really deeply into their interests, no matter what they are. I think one of the problems that happens with learning in the early years, at least, is that we tend to really devalue young children's interests. We tend to think that the interests of young children are entirely trivial and a waste of time. And therefore, we don't help them follow those interests, because they're interested in things like Pokemon or Bluey or Peppa Pig or Lego or all sorts of things. But rarely are they really, really fascinated about geography or history. Sometimes they are. I've met some young children who are interested in those kind of things, but more often it's things like diggers or dinosaurs. And we tend to think that that kind of information isn't really worth it. And therefore, we don't invest in those interests in the same way, particularly as they get a bit older, actually. What I see is that people do often invest in those interests with their really young children, their sort of 3 and 4 year olds, before they are at school. But once they're in school, Their out of school interests tend not to be valued in the same way. We see those as a waste of time or just playing, whereas we see school as the kind of real thing that children should be doing. And I think we need to kind of flip that around, because I think that's actually what's really important in those years up to puberty, certainly, is just the chance to dive deeply into the things you're interested in, the chance to explore the world. So I think we should stop pathologizing children who don't fit into the system. We should stop saying, you are the problem. Instead, we should be saying, okay, what's happening at school which isn't working? And I think we need to work towards a system that has the flexibility for all to succeed in different ways. And that's never going to happen in a system which prioritizes test results over everything else. Now, I know you're going to say this is all very well, but what about my child who is not going to school right now, and the school is not really interested in being flexible? I've tried to talk to them, because that will always be my number one recommendation. Go in, talk to school, see what flexibility there is. Because I know because I'm a psychologist and I've seen children in many, many different schools, and now I work online, but previously I would work in an actual area. So I would see children who might be going to the same schools or who might be going to neighboring schools. And I would hear that schools have very, very different approaches. So that even though we're often told it's all the same, it's not at all. You might find one school is very rigid, has zero flexibility. Another school has quite a lot of flexibility and might have staff who really understand your child. So my first thing would be always go in and see what flexibility there might be at school. See what things you might be able to do differently so that school becomes more tolerable. That isn't the case for everybody, but for some people, that can make a difference. For individuals right now who are struggling with school, I think it's really important to value what they're doing outside of school, because what I find is that parents often get pulled into a kind of school dynamic with children who are struggling. What I mean by that is schools will say, parents need to be on our side. Parents need to support the school. And what that can mean is parents have to do what the school says, basically. So I've talked to parents who say, the school said that we must make her get dressed every morning, and that we must, if she wasn't going to go into school, we must not talk with her all day to show her that she should be at school. And they did that because they were told to do that. And one of them said, I just have this awful memory of my daughter, aged about 30, no, she was 11, going to secondary school, in school uniform, sitting at the top of the stairs, and us not talking to her for the whole day, because that's what we've been told to do. And that's actually in some of the books about what to do with your child who won't go to school. I found one of the books which has a handout to parents, which says the parents should aim for an atmosphere of solitary confinement around a child who's not going to school, which I found truly shocking, actually, because this was a book written by mental health professionals, written by psychiatrists. I have never seen a recommendation in a book about children's mental health anywhere else which has suggested that parents should aim for an atmosphere of solitary confinement around their child for 6 or 7 hours a day. But yet it's like with school, we have a completely different mindset. And I know, for example, as myself, when I wasn't attending school, I know it was awful. I know I already felt completely like I was a kind of social pariah. I felt like I couldn't go out the house because people might see me and they would say, why aren't you at school? If my parents had then refused to talk to me as well, that would have made me absolutely desperate really quickly. So I think that parents need to be thinking, okay, we don't have to be pulled into these school dynamics. We can make decisions for ourselves about what's best here. And I think one thing to keep in mind is that your relationship with your child is going to last far longer than the relationship with the school. You hope. You don't want to, in 10 years' time, the school won't be interested anymore. Your child will have grown beyond the school. That will have moved on. But your relationship with your child is going to still be there. And so you want to make sure that you are prioritizing that relationship with the child, because they need to know that you're there beside them and that you're going to help them find a way forwards. Because the children I see who are the most despairing and who take the longest to recover are those children who have given up the hope that anybody's going to help them. Because if you think about a child who's saying effectively through their behavior, this is not working for me, I'm not happy with this, and the message that they're getting from school is, it's your fault, keep trying, or we'll give you a sticker if you come, or we'll punish you if you don't come. And the message they're getting from the parents is, we won't talk to you if you stay home, we're not listening to you, you've got to keep going. Really quickly that child can drop into despair. And you don't want your child dropping into despair, particularly in their teenage years. You know, it's a really vulnerable stage of development, and well-being is absolutely fundamental. It's more important that they feel loved by you and that they know that you're there to listen to them than they go to school or not. So you can, so investing in their interests is really important. So one of the things I often say is that if parents do have any extra money, if a child's struggling, they'll often invest that extra money in coaching or things that they're more things about school. So you might have a maths tutor, or you might get books about more stuff at school, but they don't invest it in the things that the child is really interested in, because they don't see those as the same kind of level of worth, particularly thinking about video games here. So if your child is really interested in video games, is their passion, then I would get in there with them and do those things with them and find out what they really value about it and spend a bit of time doing it with them. So when I say investing in their interests, I don't just mean with money, actually. I also mean with your own energy. Taking off the pressure as much as possible about exams. Most children are being told at school that exams are the be-all and end-all of their life, that they will ruin their life if they don't do well. So you need to try and provide a counterbalance where you say, you know what, people do fail these things, and that people do just not take them. And, you know, they still carry on. Life goes on. There are different ways to find a path. This isn't going to be the end of your life. So decatastrophizing about the future, even if it all goes wrong, we'll still be there with you. Showing them that they are clear-sighted rather than failures. I do a lot of reframing with children. So a lot of what I would be talking about is, you know, yeah, I absolutely agree. That does sound really annoying. I wouldn't like that either. Rather than, you know, why can't you just do what everybody else does? Even if secretly you're kind of wishing, of course you want your child to thrive. Everybody wants their child to be happy at school. And focusing on those unconditional relationships. So focusing on that idea that what the most important thing for your child to know is that you are there with them and you've got their back. And that is more important than being on the side of school, I would say. Even though that's a really hard position to take, because you may then find that you are taking some of the blame from school because school are saying, oh, you're not supporting us. And that is true to a certain point, because you do actually need to support your child more than you need to support the school. Because what children really need, if they're struggling with school, is they need hope that their future is going to be different. The children who have the most struggles, the children who find it hardest to recover after a bad time at school, are those who've lost hope that things can be different. So those who just think there's no future for me. So they don't just think things are bad now, they think it's going to be bad forever. Because if I don't go to school, I won't be able to get my exams, and I won't be able to do this, I won't be able to do this, I won't be able to do this. All they see is kind of won'ts and limits. And you really need to try and just ignite that sort of spark again of, you know, there's a future out there for you. We're going to find that future. We don't know what way we're going to find it yet, but we're going to find it. And that's when recovery starts to happen, I think, when they start to feel hopeful again. So just a quick recap. Many children are struggling to attend school, and our tendency is to blame them and their parents. And instead, I think we need to really look at the interaction between the school system and children, particularly when we've got such a large number of children who are effectively saying the same thing. Because our school system ignores basic principles of child psychology and motivation. And I think so we really need to think differently about education in order to create a change. And we can't continue to measure outcomes or by the same yardsticks that have been set out for us by generations before. But for individuals right now, doing something different starts with hope. It starts with us having hope, adults having hope. Because I think if a child sees that their parents, their educators have lost hope for them, then again, that makes them feel more despondent. And what we want to do for children who are really struggling with school is show them that they're going to be okay, and that we've got faith that they're going to be okay. Okay, so if you'd like to keep in touch with me, you can join my mailing list at naomifisher.co.uk. These are my books. The two on the right, A Different Way to Learn and Changing Our Minds, are both about self-directed education. Naughty Step, When the Naughty Step Makes Things Worse, is about parenting for children who haven't read the parenting books, so children who do not respond well to rewards and punishments. And the one at the bottom, The Teenager's Guide to Burnout, is coming out on December the 5th. And it is very much a book for teenagers for whom school has gone wrong. So it says burnout, but it's really about burnout from school. So it has quite a lot I hope, for the clear-sighted teenager who needs to know that other people also see the problems. And it has some real life stories as well of adults for whom school didn't really go well and who've gone on to live different and interesting lives. So, and I've got a book launch on the 2nd of December. If you want to come along to that, it's on Eventbrite. You can find it under my name on Eventbrite, and it's completely free. Okay, thank you all very much for listening. And I'm going to hopefully stop sharing my slides, I think.
Well, thank you very much, Naomi. That was fantastic. We're going to get into some questions. I apologize in advance to everyone. We are not going to get to them all, but I'll try to share some of the questions with the most general sort of appeal or interest. So Naomi, there's a couple questions here. Somebody asked about, like what age do we start respecting children's choice to not go to school? They can't anticipate consequences, but feel like can advocate clearly by 3. Curious on your thoughts, and also from a parent perspective, how will I know when to stop trying with school and home educate or do something different?
Well, that's a really interesting one. I mean, there's no fixed answer. I think there can often be a period of getting used to anything new for any child. So I wouldn't immediately, if your child's very unhappy right at the start, I wouldn't immediately jump to think, okay, this isn't working. But I don't think there's really an age at which we should listen or not listen, because I think if a child's unhappy and things aren't working for them, then I don't think there's a particular age at which we say, yes, okay, we'll listen to you about that now. I do think I think most parents that I talk to, when they're saying, when do we make this decision, they've usually been trying really hard for quite a long time. It's unusual that I meet parents who are like a couple of weeks in who say, oh, should we be giving up on school? Usually, if you want to help yourself make the decision, I would think back over your child's entire school career, but also about the things that you know about your child, because I think parents are very well tuned into their children. Usually you have quite a good idea of the things that your child finds easy or hard, or things that what your child enjoys. And I would just give yourself a bit of time and space to think through your child's school day using what you know about your child, and thinking, okay, what is this actually probably like for them? Because I think sometimes in order to send our children off to school, we have to kind of dampen down our own knowledge of what that might be like for them. And I think this is the time to kind of come back in touch with it. Okay, what do I think this is really right for them? Do I think this is really the right place for them? But then there's the other element, which is it's really hard to take a child out of school. It's never convenient. There's no easy, convenient choice of alternative education, at least there isn't in the UK. And it may be that you cannot do that because maybe you're a single parent and you haven't got a source of income. And that is just the way it is. And I think, every bit has to work for you to be able to take a child out of school. It's not just about unfortunately, it's not just about whether it's working for the child or not. It's like we have to make our whole life work.
Great. We had a kind of a series of questions, all sort of related around like, maybe approaches or things you've had parents like, trying to work with the school,
Yeah.
whether it's, their kid has an autism diagnosis or neurodivergent in some way, like
Yeah.
approaches to things to ask, I don't, how do
What do
you,
they do? You mean what kind of things do they do? Is that what you mean?
what,
What are
what,
the adjustments they make?
what kind of things have
Yeah.
parents, brought to
Yeah.
schools like, hey,
Yeah.
can we
What
do
have they
this? Yeah.
what have they successfully done? Okay, so the kind of adjustments that I hear about mostly are things like not having to come to school at the same time as everybody else. So if an autistic child, for example, finds a really busy playground, a bad start to the day, or maybe they arrive and they're like, I can't deal with this straight away, or maybe I don't know if you have the same in US schools, but in UK schools, often primary schools start with assembly, which means all the children of the school go and sit in the hall for half an hour, which many children find really challenging. So some schools have given permission for a child to come in after assembly, for example, which means that they skip the whole busy assembly stage. other other things that I've known people have as adjustments are things like a key individual coming to meet the child at the beginning of the day. So one person I knew had would have the school receptionist would come to meet the child, and they would have a job for the child to do, and it was often something like shredding because the child likes shredding. So it would be a kind of soft start to the day of, great, you're here, you're welcome. Would you like to come and do some shredding with me to make that transition easier? When it comes to the whole sort of school day, that can help are things like building in some decompression time and movement breaks during the day. So I know one school that had circuits in their playground, like a sort of circuit thing to, climb on and climb under, and the children could go out regularly in the lessons and do a kind of circuit and then come back again. Some children find the playground and lunchtime are the most challenging parts of the day. And I think this is particularly tricky when the child finds the playground and lunch breaks the hardest times, because the school day has a kind of rhythm to it where, you're in lessons, then you have a break, then you have lessons again, then you have what's meant to be a break. If the break doesn't feel like a break, then you're just on the whole time, So if a child finds the playground really difficult, or they find lunchtime horrible because the smell of the dining hall is horrible and the noise is horrible, then you want to think about, is there a way that we could build in breaks, their actual breaks for them? So might there be somewhere they could go quietly? Might they be able to just spend the time with one other person? Is there a way that we could make those the breaks that are already there in the school day an actual break for them? Because sometimes children are obliged to go to certain places or be in the playground in those times. What are the other things? Laura Kirby, who wrote a book about PDA and education, she talks about going through the timetable and thinking about what are the things that are easiest and hardest for my child over the whole week, and how can we so she talks about it as, she says, kind of color code the timetable with green for the things that they like, amber for the things that are a bit tricky, and red for the things that are really, really difficult, so that you can see what their week looks like. And then you can maybe say, okay, so maybe right now we're not going to do the red things. Would that be possible? That actually, if they find whatever it is, science, really, really difficult, could we just not do that for now and do the other things? And I do know schools who've agreed reduced timetables for young people like that as well. But it depends very much on the schools. And the other thing about school is that often it comes down to the individuals. So I know, particularly in elementary school or primary school, people will say, we had this one teacher in this year and it was great. They just really got them. And then they went to the next year and it was a different teacher and it was a completely different experience. That's really hard to factor in, because what makes the difference? It's hard to know what makes the difference. I don't think it's training that makes the difference between the teacher who really gets it and the teacher who doesn't. But it can sometimes be a matter of individuals. So it may be that being in a different class, for example, can make the difference.
We had a quick follow-up question on this. Anything with like older kids, adjustments that,
Yes.
like what kind of things have you seen there?
Yes. So with older kids, again, it's more tricky because it really depends on the school. And in the UK, secondary schools tend to be less flexible than primary schools. So there's less flexibility. But I do know of young people who have been allowed to do fewer subjects, to drop some of their subjects, and then have been allowed to spend that time doing something that they're really passionate about. So learning about something they're really interested in. That would again depend on the child being able to manage that, and there being the space to manage that. But I do know young people for whom that's happened. Again, it's been about breaks and lunch breaks, been about somewhere to go in those times so that they're not just kind of adrift. So it actually sometimes I find that things like chess club or book clubs and that kind of thing often fulfill that space for children, because they're really nice non-pathologizing ways to go and spend your lunch somewhere else rather than with everybody else. And again, just things like slower, like a sort of soft start. If you can manage to get a soft start, I know you don't have this problem in the United States, I don't think. In the UK, uniform is often a big issue, particularly for autistic children, that it's the sensory issues. And I do know some schools have been flexible on that and some completely aren't. It's just luck of the draw. Yeah.
Thank you. We had some questions around, I guess maybe slightly different than the topic here. You've been in situations where you work with a family where the child actually wants to be in school, but there's
Yes.
something,
But
maybe it's a
yeah.
social part or something that just makes
Yeah.
it really not.
Yes, lots of children like that. which I think makes perfect sense, because I do think there's a kind of, oh, maybe indoctrination isn't quite the right word, but I think there is a kind of indoctrination process that we all go through. I would certainly say I've gone through it, where you're told school is the right place to be. You should be at school. Right from, when we start reading little stories to children before they start school, it's all about going to school and you learn all these things. So I think it's not at all surprising that children, even when school really, really isn't working for them, say they want to be there. And I think it's important to think about what that actually means for that child. So are they saying they want to be there? Lots of children will be saying they want to be there because they think that if they're not there, they've got no future. So of course you want to be there because they think, if I don't get my exams, I won't ever have an interesting job. So I think it's important to try and unpick a bit with them about what that really means, what it is that they're trying to get out of being there. But yeah, but I think there are some children who I have met, some children who really, really want to be at school, but who clearly it absolutely isn't working for. I've met children who've developed all sorts of symptoms. Like one child wasn't able to eat anymore, and she wasn't talking at school, but she still felt she had to be at school. And for her, it was that she felt that if she didn't go to school, it means she was bad. I don't know how she managed to learn that, but she felt very much that it would be bad. So actually, in her case, her parents made the decision for her because they could see how unwell she was becoming. And I talked to her a few years later about it, and she said, I was so angry with them. I was really, really angry that they made the decision. But I think in some cases you do have to, because it's like with anything else, that a child might really, really want to do something, but not be able to do it yet, or not be able to do it. And as a parent, at some point you might have to say, yes, I know it really sucks. I wish you could do it. I wish it would work for you, but we can see it's not. And it's really difficult. And you might have to go through a kind of grieving process with them when they're grieving, really, and you might be grieving as well, the future, the sort of map in their head of what they thought was going to happen. Because when you stop going to school, it's like you cancel all the years in advance, don't you? It's like you don't have any more the prom or all the other things that you thought you were going to have. You have to find a different path. And I think for children, particularly for autistic children, it can be really hard to imagine what's it going to be like if I don't do that. So yeah, but I've come across lots of children, and there is never an easy answer to it, I'm afraid.
We had a couple questions just around sort of the mix between home and school. So is it an all or nothing sort of thing? Is it appropriate at some point to be in school? Is it appropriate to leave and do home education and then maybe go back? It's like, have you seen situations where
lots of
it's
people do
like
that.
not an all or nothing
Yeah,
situation?
totally. Loads of people do that, I think. And I think also there can be times when I know lots of children who maybe don't go to school for a couple of years and they want to try school again. They maybe try it out for a couple of years and they decide they don't want to do it again. Requires quite a lot of flexibility from everybody. But I think the norm is probably in not all or nothing. I mean, I don't mean the norm, obviously the norm is school attendance, but I mean, when you have a child who isn't going to school, I think it's quite common for maybe them to be out of school for a while, then maybe back in school for a bit. Maybe they might try it out again when there's a change of school, when they get to 11 or as they get older. And then I know lots of young people who don't go to school and then go into more formal education at 16. In the UK, we have college at that stage. So it's quite common for them to start going then. Or we also have, sometimes people can do kind of halfway house. I don't know if people have that in the US, but like when they're aged 14 to 16, there are some colleges which will allow them to just do a couple of subjects. So they can start to do a bit more formal education and a bit not. And then people also do online. Quite a lot of people will enroll in online schools, and sometimes those are like full-time, a bit like a school replacement, and sometimes they're not. Sometimes it's just like, we'll just do maths and English, or I always say to parents, don't start with maths and English, because unless they love maths and English, which is kind of not always the case, but more like, let's start with whatever they really like. If they're really interested in something, do that first. Just like if they're really interested in 3D art, do a course in that. Get it, start where they are, start what they're interested, what they're interested in.
We had a question, and I don't know if there's any definitive authoritative thing, about this yet, but just sort of the pandemic and COVID. I think I've seen the numbers, at least in the United States, of chronic absenteeism in some of the big urban districts was like exploded and not really
Yeah,
recovered.
never
After
came back.
things went
Yeah.
back to normal. Like what is your sense of that? Like, is that a thing or is
Yes.
what's yeah.
Yes. I don't know what the research shows. I mean, my sense is also similar. And I think a couple of things went on there. I think one was that um, well, they closed the schools. And that's a very big statement. And that had not happened before. And we had told children, we were all told as children, whatever happens, school keeps going, you keep going to school. And then suddenly overnight, it turned out you didn't, you could close the schools. And I think that was quite a shattering moment for lots of young people in thinking, oh, some of these sort of eternal truths that I thought were the case, like, school is always there, doesn't turn out to be the case anymore. But I also think that um, I think so. I think there are a few different groups. One group of kids who I know really loved lockdown, really enjoyed schools being closed, really liked nobody going to school. So there was no more, they weren't apologized anymore for not going because nobody was going. And they kind of, I think, sometimes their parents saw how much happier they were. And so their parents thought, okay, actually, we're not going to send them back because actually life is a lot better without going to school.
Mhm.
Then I think there were a group of children for whom the pandemic kind of came at a stage of their life where they were still working out. Well, children are still working out through their whole childhood, but they were still working out how everything worked and what made them feel safe, and they're kind of building their understanding of the world. And one of the things that younger children think is that their parents can do everything. So most young children think their parents can sort out everything. Doesn't matter what, parents will be able to deal with it. And I think that the pandemic kind of shattered that for a lot of children too early. So I think just the fact that, everybody had to stay at home and this wasn't something their parents could do anything about, and the playgrounds were all locked and this wasn't something their parents could do anything about. I think for lots of children, that kind of contributed to a sense of lack of safety at a stage where they were developmentally not really ready for it. So, it was a destabilizing thing for everybody, for all of us. But for those of us who were adults when it happened, we were able to think back and we knew that it wasn't always like that and it would probably be change again. Whereas the children, very quickly, they couldn't really remember things being different because they have they're much younger, they have a much shorter lifespan. And so for them, they didn't have this kind of, oh, that was normality. This is unusual. For them, that became normality. And there was a sense during the pandemic of other people being risky because of, you might spread the virus. And I think that that did contribute to a lot of young people becoming quite anxious who maybe wouldn't have otherwise gone down that path. So I think it's different. I don't think there's one thing that happened. I think there's different things that happened for lots of different young people. And
Yeah.
then also just actually to add to that, in the UK anyway, unfortunately, what happened when schools actually did go back in person was it was quite draconian quite quickly. So there was a lot of talk about catching up and how everyone was behind, and now we'd have to push. And I think that was so short-sighted because I remember at the time thinking they're not behind because this has happened to this entire generation. There's no other fantasy generation who hasn't had this experience. They are completely where they are, this group. And really, we should be looking to let them catch up on play and social emotional experiences, because my children were 8 and 11 when the pandemic started. And I remember thinking at the time, the academic stuff they'll be able to catch up on, but what they won't be able to catch up on is they can't play with other children. They can't go out and play because everything is kind of restricted for them.
Yeah.
And I just wish that we had, when we came back after the pandemic, that there had been a time of let's get that play, let's let them have as much play as they can now to sort of help them catch up on that, rather than let's get back to the maths and English.
Yeah, I'm mindful of time. Maybe just do you have time for one more question, Naomi, and then we'll
Mm-hmm.
wrap up. Okay. Yeah, this question just like common denominator. Are there any common denominators for like school avoidance, whether, personality, neurological? Is there anything that you see that's just like more common, I guess, for kids who want to, avoid in school?
Is there anything I see? I think it's more that I see common denominators in the schools rather than necessarily in the young people. I think I see a hugely diverse range of young people. People will sometimes, obviously, we talk a lot about neurodivergence and about autistic young people struggling with school, but I also see a lot of non-autistic young people who struggle with school. and who find it really difficult, and who I think it's that interaction between the child and the school. And the schools that I see that have the most difficulties are those that are trying to be very exam focused and are trying to be very high pressure and a very high control, and just don't seem to be in touch developmentally with children's needs. But I mean, basically, the factor I see is the more flexible a school is able to be, the more children they are able to include. The more rigid they become, the more flexibility they require from the children, and the more that happens, the more children kind of fall by the wayside because they can't do what's being required of them by school, and the school isn't giving. There's no flexibility in the school. So yeah, I don't see any. There's no way I would be able to necessarily. Actually, what do I mean that? I think there are some children who just don't are clearly not into doing what they're told, actually. And I think these are the children who I talk about a lot, and I write the naughty step is really for them. um there are children who just come into life with, I don't need to do what I don't want to do what you're telling me. I want to live my own life. And I think they're fantastic, these children. I think they're extremely clear-sighted. They're the children who will go on to change the world. But it's quite hard to be a child when you're like that, because school is based on doing what you're told and fitting and doing what everybody else does. And if you're as a child who isn't doing that, then school is going to be really challenging for them, and they are going to be really challenging for school. The two things will go together.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you all for being here, and special thanks to Dr. Fisher for joining us today. Again, we'll be sending a follow-up email to everyone who registered on Eventbrite with the recording of the talk and related, self-directed education resources. So thank you again, and goodbye.
Thank you so much, Joel.